even before we get to Sheikh's criticism, Minsky was always very skeptical of this idea that there was an unlimited amount of government debt that you could issue. Okay, now there are a number of reasons for this, which he spelled out quite clearly. You don't have, it's not necessary to go back and look at all of them. But if you're a financial market operator, okay, you recognize that there are limits to the amount of debt that you can issue. Now, the difficulty is that really nobody backing MMT should ever have made that argument. Okay? The technical limit to the argument is one that you go back and you say, okay, if you have the argument that says the government budget should always be balanced, okay, MMT provides you with an argument which says that that particular proposition is false, okay, in terms of a policy proposition. Now, whether we needed MMT to do that or not, I'm not sure. I mean, when Keynes used Kahn's multiplier in order to demonstrate that savings would always equal the amount of investment or whatever it was, you had already solved that problem. Okay? So you really didn't need MMT to make that particular argument. So those people who say that there is an unlimited supply of government debt that you can issue really are overstating, broadly overstating the case. Now, if you look at the way Keynes dealt with this argument, the papers that these really weren't papers, these were internal policy documents that came out in the Treasury after the Second World War, it's quite clear that what he had in mind was to say that you can always, well, if you look at a passage in I think it was a BBC program that he made, where he was talking about the post-war reconstruction finance. And he said very clearly, the problem is not finance. It is finance we can solve. And that's the argument that in a fractional reserve banking system, okay, the supply of finance is infinite, technically infinite. And his argument was, well, the problem is not finance. The problem is that we lack architects and we lack bricks and we lack the things that are necessary in order to reconstruct. Okay, so you might want to go in the other direction and say, well, Keynes believed in a system of real variables rather than monetary variables. Well, that's not correct either, but that gives you some idea of how he looked at this ability to run a government deficit. You can run a government deficit, and I think this is the correct enunciation of what you get out of MMT. That is, the government has the ability to buy anything that can be produced by issuing its liability. That's correct. That is, there is always excess capacity, and you can always buy a little bit more if you choose to do so. Okay, if you go back to Joan Robinson and her discussion of disguised unemployment, okay, there are always some margin in terms of increasing productivity in the system and so forth. But that doesn't mean that you have an unlimited possibility of increasing your indebtedness. And it's that point that Sheikh's criticism comes in. That is, it is a criticism of the unlimited issue of government debt, which says that, yes, you have internal consistency problems. And if you're willing to run in a system which has an ever-increasing rate of inflation and an ever-increasing rate of unemployment, you end up in Sheikh's sort of worst of all possible worlds. And that's perfectly plausible. But the problem is that you started out with the wrong premise rather than this is a real criticism. Now, there are, and one of the problems is that if you look at the way MMT is enunciated now, you have a large number of people who, shall I say, are not, how can we put this nicely? That do not have the appropriate theoretical and historical background in order to recognize the limits on that proposition. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why I've been extremely frustrated in the way this discussion has gone on, because a lot of people have simply looked on this as now a carte blanche on the ability to spend as much as you want whenever you want to do it, rather than recognizing that these internal constraints do, in fact, whether they're internal or external constraints, actually do exist. Your external constraint is, if you look at your domestic economy, there is a maximum that you can produce. Even if you generate, if you eliminate all of your disguised unemployment, you do run into a limit, and then you run into a constraint. Or if you start borrowing resources from abroad, you end up with a limit on your sovereignty, and that's an external limit. So that's I think in that dimension. But the Shank's proposition, given that premise, is in fact correct.